So now, are there meaningful differences across SES in this part of the input, the WH dependencies and the syntactic trigrams, right? Like that's our question. And we can use developmental modeling to find out. But first, we might just sort of wonder, how different does this input actually look across SES, right? Or what kind of measurable differences are there in that input? And so let's look at the distribution of the relevant parts according to our learning strategy, which is the WH dependencies again and the syntactic trigrams. And one way to measure differences in distribution, because of course we're looking at distribution of the WH dependencies, of which there are a whole bunch, and of syntactic trigrams, of which there are a whole bunch. So it's the distribution of these things that we care about. And one way to measure differences in distribution is something called the Jensen-Shannon divergence. We'll abbreviate it JSDiv for short. It's from information theory. And it basically ranges between 0 and 1. And 0 means these are like totally identical distributions in every way. And 1 means they are like the most dissimilar distributions ever, right? So closer to 0 is more like, right? And so let's talk about the input samples that we used to investigate this. So first, our sample of high SES child-directed speech was 102,000 some utterances, about 21,000 WH dependencies from the child's tree bank of speech directed at 25 high SES children between the ages of 1 and 5 years old. Our low SES sample was of child-directed speech. It was about 31.8 thousand utterances, about 3.9 thousand WH dependencies from a subpart of the HSLD corpus in the child's tree bank of speech directed at 78 low SES children between the ages of 3 and 5. And in case you're curious, SES in this case was defined by the creators of that corpus according to 2 factors. Maternal education, where the mothers of the children that were in this corpus had anywhere from 6 years to some post-high school education, and annual income, where 70% of the participants come from households making less than $20,000 a year at this time. So these were our low SES samples. And then we also, and you'll see why in a moment, also looked at high SES adult-directed speech. So we have 74.6 thousand utterances, about 8.5 thousand WH dependencies from the switchboard corpuses of adults speaking to each other over the phone, right? And so, okay, so we have these 3 input samples. And, what do we find in particular is high SES child-directed speech more like low SES child-directed speech, or more like high SES adult-directed speech, right? Like which one is it closer to? This is basically asking or telling us if high SES child-directed speech is more like low SES child-directed speech, then SES differences really matter less than who the speech is directed at. We're always going to have differences, but like how much difference do we have? And if these 2 are more alike, well then SES differences don't matter as much as who the speech is directed at, children or adults, versus if we find the other pattern of high SES child-directed speech is more like high SES adult-directed speech, then SES differences matter more than who the speech is directed at, right? Like, so what are we finding with this kind of measure, right? And it turns out we find the first case, right? Whether we look at WH dependencies or syntactic trigrams, we find the same pattern. High SES and low SES child-directed speech are more similar than high SES child-directed and high SES adult-directed, right? So SES matters less, right, than who we're talking to, right? In particular, if you're curious about the numbers, for WH dependencies, high SES child-directed speech is twice as similar to low SES child-directed speech as to high SES adult-directed, right? This number is half, about less than half of what this number is, right? So higher, remember, is more dissimilar, right? So it's more similar, about twice as similar. And the same is true, for syntactic trigrams, right? So again, this number is about half, a little less than half of this. So this is really much more similar than this is, right? So it matters more who you're talking to, children or adults, than the SES differences. So it suggests that basically this part of the input, when you're zooming in on this part, looks pretty similar across SES, certainly more similar than child-directed versus adult-directed speech within SES, right? So that's our measurable input differences. There are differences, but they're pretty close,